Welcome to Lore of the Ring, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. In the beginning, before light kissed the face of Arda, before the music of creation rang through the halls of eternity, there existed something that should not have been. A presence that dwelt in the spaces between notes, in the silence that devours song itself. Her name would become legend, whispered in terror across the ages of Middle-earth. But in those primordial moments, she was nameless. A hunger so vast and terrible that even the darkness fled from her touch. Ungoliant, the Gloomweaver, the devourer of light. She came not from the thoughts of Eru Ilúvatar, nor from the discord of Melkor's rebellion. She emerged from the void itself, that black emptiness that existed before creation, after destruction, and in the hollow spaces where hope dies. While the Ainur sang worlds into being, she fed upon the silence between their harmonies. While Varda kindled the first stars, Ungoliant spun webs that could strangle starlight itself. Picture, if you can, the moment of her first stirring. The cosmic darkness rippled like black water, and from its depths rose something that was neither flesh nor spirit, but pure appetite given form. She was shadow made hungry, emptiness that yearned to fill itself with the destruction of all things bright and beautiful. Her body, when she chose to take one, was that of a monstrous spider. But this was merely the shape her malice wore. For her true form was the absence of form, the negation of everything that is. The chroniclers of elder days speak of her in hushed tones, for even their ancient wisdom could barely comprehend what she represented. She was not evil, as mortals understand evil. She was not driven by hatred or jealousy or the desire for dominion. She was entropy incarnate, the cosmic force that seeks to return all complexity to void, all light to darkness, all song to silence. Where Melkor corrupted, Ungoliant consumed. Where he sought to rule, she sought to devour even the possibility of rule. In those early ages, when the world was young and the Valar still walked openly in Middle-earth, strange tales filtered back from the edges of creation. Explorers spoke of regions where the very air grew thick and black, where plants withered not from drought or disease, but from something far more fundamental, as if the essence of growth itself had been eaten away. They described webs vast beyond imagining, stretching between mountains like the rigging of some cosmic ship. But these were not webs meant to catch prey. They were nets cast to snare light itself, to trap the radiance of sun and moon and star until it could be slowly, methodically consumed. The wise among the elder began to understand that these were the hunting grounds of something ancient and terrible, something that predated their arrival in Middle-earth by ages uncounted. They called her the Night Mother, the darkness that hungers, the shadow before shadow. But none truly comprehended the scope of her appetite until it was far too late. For Ungoliant's hunger was not merely physical, it was metaphysical, spiritual, existential. She did not simply devour light, she consumed the very concept of illumination. She did not merely kill, she unraveled the threads of being itself, leaving behind not death but unbeing, spaces in reality where things had never existed at all. Those who encountered her works came away changed, marked by an emptiness they could never quite explain, a sense that something fundamental had been torn away from the world, leaving only a woo, and that could never heal. And yet, for all her terrible power, Ungoliant was not content. Her hunger grew with feeding, expanding like a black hole that devours entire galaxies, yet only grows more ravenous with each morsel consumed. She had tasted the lesser lights of creation, the phosphorescence of deep waters, the pale glow of certain stones, the life fire that burned in the hearts of all living things. But these were mere appetizers, fleeting satisfactions that only made her aware of a greater feast that lay beyond her reach. For in the blessed realm of Valinor, beyond the circles of the world, grew two trees whose light put all other illumination to shame. Telperion and Laurelin, the silver and golden trees of the Valar, whose radiance gave life to all the world, whose beauty inspired the creation of sun and moon and stars. Their light was not merely bright, it was light itself, the fundamental force that opposed her darkness, the primordial illumination from which all other lights were but pale reflections. Ungoliant dwelt in the uttermost south, in a region that maps did not mark and geographers did not name, a place called Avathar, where the world's edge met the encircling darkness. There she spun her webs and nursed her hunger and dreamed dreams of radiance devoured. But the two trees were beyond her reach, protected by the might of the Valar, surrounded by the blessed light of Valinor, where no shadow could long endure. She might have remained there forever, a nightmare lurking at the world's edge, her hunger growing but never fulfilled. The cosmic balance might have held, darkness and light maintaining their eternal dance, neither able to fully triumph over the other. The trees might have continued their endless cycle of bloom and rest, their light spilling out to nourish all the world, their beauty inspiring song and poetry and hope in equal measure. But in the depths of her passion, hunger, another dark will was watching, and it would call her name. Far from the blessed light of Valinor, in the iron dungeons of Angband where no star could penetrate, Melkor, who would be known to later ages as Morgoth, the dark enemy of the world, brooded in his fortress of malice. Once the mightiest of the Ainur, the firstborn of Eru's thought, he had fallen far from his original glory. His rebellion against the music of creation had ended in defeat and humiliation. The Valar had bound him in the halls of Mandos for 3 ages of the world, and though he had feigned repentance and won his freedom, his heart burned with a hatred that time had only intensified. But Melkor was no mere rebel nursing wounded pride. He was cunning beyond the measure of any other being in Arda, save perhaps Manwë himself, and his long imprisonment had given him time to think, to plan, to nurture schemes that would make his previous discord seem like a child's tantrum. He had learned patience in those dark years, had discovered the subtle art of seeming rehabilitation while feeding the flames of vengeance deep within his spirit. Now, free once more, but watched by wary eyes, he understood that his next move must be both perfect and absolute. The problem was simple. Alone, he could not hope to challenge the combined might of all the Valar. Manwë's eagles watched the skies, Ulmo's waters carried news across all the world, and Orome's hunters tracked every shadow that moved across the land. Valinor was protected not just by walls and guards, but by the very light of the trees themselves. A radiance so pure that it revealed all deception, exposed all malice, made darkness visible and vulnerable. But what if that light could be extinguished? The thought came to him gradually, growing from a whisper of possibility to a roar of certainty. The two trees were not merely symbols of the Valar's power. They were the source of it, the wellspring from which all their strength flowed. Without their light, Valinor would be as vulnerable as any other realm. Without their illumination, the Valar would be forced to rely on lesser powers, powers that he, Melkor, could match or even exceed. Yet how could such a deed be accomplished? The trees were guarded not just by vigilant sentries, but by their own nature. Their light was anathema to corruption, their presence made evil manifest and weak. No servant of his could approach them, no creature of shadow could endure their radiance long enough to do them harm. He needed something else, something that existed outside the normal hierarchy of good and evil, something that could consume light itself rather than being consumed by it. And then, in the darkness of his meditation, he remembered the stories, fragments of lore spoken in whispers even among the Ainur, tales of something that dwelt at the world's edge, something that had never bowed to Eru's will because it had never been part of Eru's creation. A hunger older than rebellion, a darkness that preceded the first light, a being whose very existence was an affront to the ordered beauty of Arda. Ungoliant. The name came to him like a revelation, and with it came a plan so audacious, so perfectly calibrated to achieve maximum destruction, that even his corrupted spirit quickened with anticipation. Here was the ally he needed, not a servant who might fail or betray, but a force of nature as implacable and terrible as entropy itself. She had what he lacked, the power to devour light. He had what she craved, knowledge of where the greatest lights could be found. But first, he had to find her. The journey to Avathar was itself an odyssey of shadow and stealth. Melkor could not simply stride across Middle-earth as he once had. Too many eyes watched. Too many hearts would recognize the darkness that traveled with him wherever he went. Instead, he went by hidden ways, through caverns that delve deeper than the roots of mountains, across wastelands where no living thing grew, along paths that existed only in the spaces between reality and nightmare. He went as a shadow among shadows, cloaked in unlight, not merely the absence of illumination, but its opposite, a darkness so profound that it actively consumed radiance rather than merely excluding it. This was one of his greatest discoveries during his imprisonment. The understanding that darkness need not be passive, need not simply wait for light to depart. It could be weaponized, made aggressive, turned into a force that actively sought out and destroyed its opposite. The journey took months, or perhaps years. Time moved strangely in the uttermost south, where the world's curvature began to approach the straight lines of eternity. Finally, he reached the edge of Avathar, and there he found the evidence of her presence. Webs that spanned valleys, their strands thick as ship's cables and black as the space between stars. Plants that had been drained not just of life, but of the very memory of life, leaving behind husks that crumbled at a touch, but somehow maintained their shape, like the shadows of flowers cast in ash. And at the center of it all, in a chasm so deep that its bottom was lost in darkness, even to his enhanced sight, he found her. Ungoliant in her full glory was a sight to make even the dark Vala pause in wonder and terror. She had grown vast during her long exile, fed by centuries of consuming lesser lights until she had become something that defied easy description. Her body was that of a spider, magnified beyond all reason, her legs spanning distances that could be measured in miles, her abdomen swollen with the concentrated essence of devoured radiance. But it was her eyes that truly revealed her nature, not the compound eyes of an insect, but single orbs of such absolute blackness that they seemed to pull light into themselves, creating whirlpools of darkness that made the surrounding air shimmer with distortion. When she spoke, her voice was not sound, but the absence of sound, words that reached the mind by destroying the silence that surrounded them. She knew him, had been aware of his approach long before he reached her domain. In the cosmic hierarchy of darkness, they recognized each other as kindred spirits, not alike in nature, but complementary in their opposition to the light. "Melkor," she said, and her voice was the sound of stars going out. "The mighty, the fallen, what brings the Lord of Angband to my dwelling place?" He had prepared speeches, elaborate rhetoric designed to convince and cajole, but in her presence he found such artifice unnecessary. She was hunger, and he was offering her the greatest feast in all creation. The negotiation was as natural as water flowing downhill. "I offer you light," he said simply. "Light such as you have never tasted. Light that is the source of all other lights in the world. I offer you the Two Trees of Valinor." Her reaction was immediate and terrifying. The darkness around her seemed to writhe with anticipation, and the webs began to vibrate with a frequency that made the very air sing with menace. For long moments she said nothing, and he could sense her vast intellect working, calculating, considering the implications of his offer. "The trees are guarded," she said finally, "protected by powers that would burn even me to nothing." "Alone, perhaps," Melkor replied, "but not together. Your hunger and my hatred, your darkness and my corruption. Together we can achieve what neither could accomplish alone. I will shield you from their light until you can begin to feed, and once you have tasted their essence, your power will grow beyond all previous limits." She considered this, her alien mind processing possibilities that would have driven lesser beings mad with their complexity. Finally she moved, her massive form rising from the depths of the chasm with a sound like the world's foundations shifting. When she reached her full height, she towered above him like a living mountain, her shadow falling across valleys and hills, her presence so overwhelming that even the concept of light seemed to flee from the vicinity. "What price do you ask for this gift?" she asked, for in her ancient wisdom, she knew that nothing in creation came without cost. Melkor's smile was a thing of terrible beauty, equal parts charm and malice. "Only that you feed well, my dear Ungoliant. Feed until you are satisfied, and let the consequences fall where they may." It was not quite a lie, but neither was it the complete truth. He had his own purposes, his own needs that would be served by the tree's destruction. But for now, it was enough that their interests aligned. The partnership need not be permanent. Indeed, he rather doubted it could be, given the nature of his proposed ally. And so the first pact of shadow was struck, not in words, but in hunger, not in promises, but in the shared recognition of opportunity. Above them, the stars seemed to dim as if sensing the magnitude of what had been set in motion. The cosmic balance that had held since the world's creation trembled on its axis, and in the halls of Valinor, sensitive hearts felt a chill they could not explain, a sense that somewhere in the darkness, something fundamental had changed. The alliance was formed. The plan was set. All that remained was its execution and the consequences that would reshape the world forever. The festival of the Valar came but once in every age, when Laurelin reached the perfect fullness of her golden bloom and Telperion achieved the most radiant silver of his luminescence. It was a time of celebration throughout Valinor, when the Ainur laid aside their vigilant watch over Middle-earth and gathered in the great amphitheatre, beneath the trees to sing the ancient songs of creation, to remember the music that brought all things into being, and to rejoice in the beauty they had helped to craft. On this night, the light of the trees blazed brighter than ever before, their combined radiance creating a symphony of gold and silver that danced across the blessed sky of Valinor. The very air seemed to sing with harmonies that mortal ears could never perceive, and the grass beneath the trees grew so luminous that each blade seemed crafted from crystallized starlight. It was a scene of such surpassing beauty that even the greatest poets of later ages would struggle to find words adequate to describe it. But in the shadows at the edge of paradise, two forms waited with infinite patience, cloaked in an unlight so profound that it created a sphere of absolute negation around them. This was no mere darkness. It was the active antithesis of illumination, a void that consumed photons before they could reveal what lay within. Even the all-perceiving gaze of Manwë could not penetrate this supernatural gloom, for it was crafted from the combined malice of Melkor and the existential hunger of Ungoliant. Melkor had spent months preparing for this moment, weaving webs of deception as intricate as any spider's snare. He had appeared at court functions with perfect courtesy, had praised the beauty of the trees with apparently genuine appreciation, had even composed songs in their honor that the other Valar found moving and profound. Every gesture had been calculated to allay suspicion, to present himself as truly reformed, a prodigal son returned to the family of his peers. Meanwhile, Ungoliant had undergone her own preparations. At Melkor's instruction, she had starved herself for decades, denying herself even the lesser lights she normally consumed, building her hunger to a crescendo of need that made her very presence warp reality around her. She had spun new webs from the essence of her own darkness, creating nets capable of snaring not just physical objects, but concepts themselves. Nets that could catch and hold the idea of light, the notion of beauty, the principle of hope. Now, as the festival reached its peak and every eye in Valinor was turned toward the celebration, they began their approach. Ungoliant moved with surprising grace for something so vast, her legs finding purchase on surfaces that should not have been able to support her weight. But then she was no longer entirely bound by the physical laws that governed lesser beings. Her hunger had grown so enormous that it had begun to affect the fundamental constants of reality around her, creating pockets of space where cause and effect operated according to different rules, where the impossible became merely improbable. Melkor guided her path with whispered directions, his knowledge of Valinor's layout combining with her preternatural ability to remain undetected. They moved through districts that should have been blazing with light, but which now seemed somehow dimmed, as if the very presence of so much concentrated darkness was beginning to affect the radiance that gave Valinor its character. Guards at their posts felt sudden drowsiness overcome them. Sentries found their attention wandering to inconsequential matters. Even the great eagles of Manwë, whose eyes could pierce any earthly darkness, felt compelled to look elsewhere whenever their gaze might have fallen upon the approaching doom. The trees themselves stood in a great court at the heart of Valinor, surrounded by gardens of such beauty that they made the most splendid mortal paradise seem barren by comparison. Flowers that sang in harmonious chorus lined paths paved with stones that each contained a captured piece of starlight. Fountains played with water that sparkled like liquid diamonds, their melodies weaving counterpoint to the greater song that emanated from the trees themselves. Laurelin, the golden tree, stood nearly 1,000 feet in height, her trunk broader than the greatest castle, her branches reaching toward the sky with a grace that spoke of divine craftsmanship. Her leaves were not mere foliage, but living light given form, each one a masterpiece of organic artistry that pulsed with warm radiance. Her flowers, when they bloomed, released drops of liquid gold that hardened into gems before they touched the ground, creating a treasure trove beneath her boughs that was renewed with each flowering. Telperion, the silver tree, was her perfect complement, slightly taller, more austere in his beauty, his bark gleaming like polished silver, his leaves shaped like the crescents of new moons. Where Laurelin's light was warm and golden, inspiring joy and celebration, Telperion's radiance was cool and silver, evoking contemplation and wonder. His dew was like liquid starlight, and when the wind moved through his branches, it created music that could move even stone hearts to tears. Together, they formed the axis around which all of Valinor revolved, the heart of the Blessed Realm, the source of all illumination in the world. Their light did more than merely shine. It actively blessed everything it touched, causing flowers to bloom more beautifully, inspiring artists to greater creativity, making the good feel more secure in their goodness, and the wise more confident in their wisdom. But now, creeping through the gardens like a living shadow, came something that was the absolute antithesis of everything the trees represented. Ungoliant approached them with the focused intensity of a predator that has finally cornered its ultimate prey. Her hunger, so long denied full satisfaction, reached a fever pitch that made the air around her shimmer with distortion. The flowers she passed did not merely wilt, they forgot how to exist, leaving behind not Eve, but the memory of their beauty. Melkor watched with fascination as his ally prepared for the feast he had promised her. She was beyond his control now, beyond anyone's control, a force of nature as unstoppable as an avalanche or a hurricane. Even he, who had bargained for this moment, felt a thrill of terror at what he was about to unleash. For he was beginning to understand that Ungoliant was not merely another servant to be used and discarded, but something far more dangerous, a partner whose appetite might prove to exceed even his own malice. The moment came when Lorelin reached the peak of her golden radiance, the signal for the festival's most sacred ceremony. But instead of the expected hymns of praise, what rang out across Valinor was a sound that had never been heard before, the song of light being devoured. Ungoliant fell upon Lorelin with the focused intensity of starvation finally given hope of satisfaction. Her mandibles, sharp enough to cut through the fabric of reality itself, pierced the tree's bark and began to drain the golden light that flowed within. But this was no simple act of destruction. She was not merely killing the tree, but consuming its essential nature, devouring the very concept of golden illumination that it embodied. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. As the light began to flow out of Lorelin and into Ungoliant's hungering maw, the golden radiance that had blessed Valinor for millennia began to dim. The jewels that had formed from her dew cracked and turned to ash. The flowers that had sung in her honor fell silent, their voices stolen, along with the light that had given them life. But Ungoliant was not content with a single tree. Even as she fed upon Lorelin's dying radiance, she extended pseudopods of pure darkness toward Telperion, beginning to drain his silver light as well. The effect was even more devastating. Where Raelin's dimming had brought a golden twilight, Telperion's failure brought utter darkness, a blackness so complete that it seemed to have weight and substance. The Valar, gathered in their amphitheater, felt the change before they saw it. The songs they had been singing faltered and died as the light that had inspired them flickered and failed. Manwë rose from his throne, his eyes blazing with sudden understanding, but even his power could not immediately penetrate the supernatural darkness that now cloaked the heart of Valinor. "To the trees!" he cried, his voice carrying the authority of storm and sky. "Some evil has come upon the light of the world." But it was already too late. By the time the Valar could rally their power and pierce the veil of unlight that surrounded the court of the trees, they found only devastation. Lorelin stood twisted and blackened, her golden bark cracked and oozing not sap, but a substance that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Telperion was worse. His silver trunk had been drained so completely that it appeared almost translucent, like the ghost of a tree rather than the tree itself. And growing ever larger in the darkness between them was Ungoliant, swollen to truly monstrous proportions by the feast of light she had consumed. The radiance of both trees now burned within her, but it was radiance transformed, light made malevolent, beauty perverted into something that hurt to perceive directly. She had become a living void, a creature-shaped hole in reality that actively consumed not just illumination, but the very possibility of illumination. As the last drops of light faded from the dying trees into her insatiable maw, Ungoliant turned her great head toward the approaching Valar. Her eyes, now blazing with the stolen light of Lorelin and Telperion, fixed upon Melkor with an expression that spoke of hunger still unsatisfied, of appetites that had only grown larger with feeding. For in her alien intelligence, she had realized a terrible truth. The trees, mighty as they were, had been mere vessels for light, not its ultimate source. Somewhere, she knew, there existed lights more concentrated, more pure, more fundamentally essential than even these great trees had been. And she could sense them now, calling to her hunger like beacons in the darkness, promising satisfaction that the trees had only hinted at. But as the last drop of light faded into her maw, Ungoliant turned her gaze upon Morgoth, for even his Silmarils burned with light she craved. The flight from Valinor was a nightmare procession across a world suddenly plunged into darkness. Where once the light of the two trees had blessed every corner of the blessed realm, now there was only shadow, not the gentle darkness of night, but something far more sinister. This was unlight, the active negation of illumination, spreading like a plague from the ruined court where Laurelin and Telperion stood as twisted monuments to cosmic violation. Ungoliant had grown vast beyond all previous measure, swollen with the devoured light of the trees, until she towered like a moving mountain of shadow and malice. Her passage left a trail of destruction that would scar the landscape of Valinor for ages to come. Gardens withered not just in body, but in memory. Fountains forgot how to sing, and even the stones of the paths cracked under the weight of so much concentrated emptiness. Behind them came the fury of the Valar, no longer the benevolent guardians of creation, but awakened powers whose wrath shook the foundations of the world. Manwë's eagles darkened the sky like storm clouds, their cries echoing with the voice of hurricane winds. Tulkas ran across the land with steps that made mountains tremble, his strength multiplied by righteous anger. Even gentle Yavanna had taken on an aspect of terrible majesty, her voice calling curses upon those who had destroyed her most beloved children. But the pursuing Val found themselves hampered by the very darkness their enemies had created. The unlight that surrounded Ungoliant was more than mere absence of illumination. It was a fundamental negation of their divine vision, a force that actively prevented perception rather than simply obscuring it. They could hear the sounds of the great spider's passage, could feel the tremors her movement caused, but they could not see their target clearly enough to bring their full power to bear. Melkor ran beside his monstrous ally, but he was no longer the commanding figure who had initiated this alliance. The magnitude of what they had accomplished, and the scope of the destruction they had unleashed, was beginning to dawn on him with uncomfortable clarity. Ungoliant was no longer the half-starved creature he had bargained with in the depths of Avathar. She had become something else entirely, something that made even his corrupted spirit quail with recognition of a hunger that might exceed his own malice. They fled northward, across the Helcaraxë, the grinding ice that connected Valinor to the shores of Middle-earth. Here, in this desolate wasteland of shifting glaciers and howling winds, they might have expected to find temporary sanctuary. But even as they entered this frozen realm, Melkor began to sense that his partnership with Ungoliant was approaching its inevitable crisis. She had fulfilled her part of their bargain with a thoroughness that exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. The trees were not merely destroyed, but utterly consumed, their light stolen so completely that even the memory of their radiance seemed dimmed in the minds of those who had known them. Valinor itself was wounded, perhaps permanently, its perfection marred by scars that might never heal. The cosmic balance between light and darkness had been fundamentally altered, tilted towards shadow in ways that would echo through all the ages of the world. But now came the matter of Paimí. During their flight across the ice, Ungoliant had grown increasingly restless, her movements becoming more erratic, her attention turning more frequently toward her companion. The light of the trees, vast as it had been, was already being consumed by the fires of her metabolism, transformed into raw power and size, but providing no lasting satisfaction. Her hunger was returning, sharper and more focused than ever before, and now it had found a new target. even hidden within the iron crown that Melkor wore, even shielded by all his power and malice, the three great jewels blazed with a light that called to her like nothing ever had before. These were not mere vessels of illumination like the trees. They were light made solid, beauty crystallized into eternal form. Within them burned the unmarred light of Valinor, as it had existed before the shadow fell. The pure radiance of creation itself captured and concentrated into gems of impossible beauty. Fëanor had wrought them in the elder days of Valinor, when his skill as a craftsman had reached heights that would never be equaled. Into their making had gone not just technical mastery, but love. Love for light, love for beauty, love for the unmarred glory of creation. They were arguably the greatest work of art ever created, surpassing even the two trees in the concentrated perfection of their radiance. And now they hung like ripe fruit before Ungoliant's hungering gaze, promising a satisfaction that the trees had only hinted at. The confrontation came in Lamath, the Great Echo, a desolate region where the winds off the sea created strange acoustic effects, amplifying sounds until they could be heard for hundreds of miles. It was here, in this land of echoing voices and distorted sound, that the alliance between darkness and shadow finally shattered. They had paused in their flight, sheltering in a great ravine, while the pursuit passed overhead. Melkor was consulting the maps he carried, plotting their route to Angband, where his fortress awaited, when he became aware that Ungoliant was watching him with an intensity that made even his corrupted flesh crawl. Her eyes, still blazing with the stolen light of the trees, were fixed upon his crown with an unmistakable expression of hunger. "The bargain is fulfilled," she said, her voice creating echoes that seemed to come from every direction at once. "The trees are consumed, the light is devoured. Now comes the time for payment." Melkor looked up from his maps, and in that moment understood that the true test of their partnership had arrived. "Payment?" he asked, though he knew perfectly well what she meant. "Was not the feast I provided sufficient compensation for your aid?" "The trees were but appetizers," Ungoliant replied, her massive form shifting position with a sound like mountains grinding together. "They have shown me what true light tastes like, and now I hunger for the real feast. Give me the Silmarils, Melkor. Give me the jewels that burn with unmarred radiance, and our bargain will be complete." The request, or perhaps demand, hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Around them, the winds of Lamath began to moan and whistle, as if the very land was holding its breath, waiting to see how this cosmic confrontation would resolve. For long moments, Melkor said nothing. His hands rose unconsciously to his crown, fingers tracing the settings that held the three great jewels. He could feel their light even through the iron that contained them, could sense their power calling to something deep within his corrupted spirit. They were his greatest treasure, his proof that he could create beauty as well as destroy it. For though Fëanor had crafted them, it was Melkor who had stolen them, who had won them through cunning and violence. More than that, they were symbols of his triumph over the Noldor, tangible proof that even the greatest works of his enemies could be taken and possessed. To surrender them now to this monstrous spider who had already been paid beyond the worth of any service would be to admit that he was not the master of this partnership, but merely another source of food for her insatiable appetite. "No," he said finally, the word echoing through the ravine with the finality of a closing tomb. "The Silmarils are mine, by right of conquest. Find other lights to feed your hunger. The world is full of them." The reaction was immediate and terrible. Ungoliant's form seemed to expand, growing larger and more menacing as her rage built to a crescendo. The unlight that surrounded her deepened, becoming so profound that it seemed to pull at the very fabric of reality, creating whirlpools of negation that made the air itself scream in protest. "You dare deny me?" she hissed, her voice now carrying harmonics that human ears were never meant to perceive. "You, who could not have approached the trees without my aid. You, who owe your triumph to my hunger. I owe you nothing more than you have already received," Melkor replied. But his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. The sheer magnitude of her rage was beginning to affect even his considerable power, creating distortions in space and time that made it difficult to think clearly. What happened next would be remembered in song and story for all the ages of the world, though few would ever understand its true significance. Ungoliant attacked the Dark Lord himself, her web-spinning organs working with supernatural speed to create nets of pure darkness that could bind even a Vala. These were not mere physical restraints, but metaphysical bonds, webs that caught and held not just the body, but the spirit, the will, the very essence of being. Melkor found himself wrapped in coils of materialized shadow, his power suddenly constrained by forces he had helped to create, but no longer controlled. The irony was not lost on him. He who had spent ages binding others to his will was now experiencing the helplessness of the bound, the terror of the trapped. Ungoliant's mandibles, sharp enough to pierce the shells of reality itself, moved toward his throat. Her hunger, no longer focused solely on the Silmarils, had expanded to encompass him entirely. Why settle for the jewels when she could devour the Dark Lord himself, consuming not just his physical form, but his power, his knowledge, his very existence? But even as the darkness closed around him, even as he felt the first touch of those terrible mandibles against his flesh, Melkor's cry for help echoed across the wastes of Lamath. It was a sound of such desperate fury, such concentrated malice and need, that it penetrated every barrier, crossed every distance, reached into the deepest pits of Angband where his servants waited. The Balrogs came at their master's call, rising from the depths like living flames given purpose. These were not the lesser demons that would plague Middle-earth in later ages, but the original Maya who had joined Melkor's rebellion in the music's earliest discord. They retained much of their original power, their forms wreathed in shadow and flame, their whips capable of striking at the spiritual as well as the physical. The battle that followed was brief but apocalyptic. The Balrog's whips of fire struck at Ungoliant from every direction, their flames the one force that could truly harm her substance of concentrated darkness. She fought back with web and mandible, with tendrils of pure negation that could snuff out even supernatural flame. But she was outnumbered and, for the first time in eons, outmatched. Gradually, inexorably, they drove her back, their coordinated assault forcing her to release her hold on Melkor and retreat into the deeper shadows of the ravine. But even in Dife, she was terrible to behold. Wounded, yes, but not destroyed. Her hatred now focused not just on light, but on the Dark Lord, who had betrayed their alliance. "This is not finished, Melkor," she hissed as she retreated into the darkness. "You have broken faith with the first darkness, violated the pact that brought down the trees. The hunger remembers, and the hunger will have its due." With that, she vanished into the shadows of the north, leaving behind only the echo of her threat and the memory of her terrible power. Melkor, freed from her webs, but bearing scars that would never fully heal, watched her go with a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had won this confrontation, had kept his precious Silmarils, but he understood that he had also made an enemy whose enmity might prove more dangerous than any opposition he had previously faced. The alliance was broken, the partnership dissolved in mutual betrayal and violence, but the consequences of their brief cooperation would echo through all the ages of the world, shaping the fate of every light that burned in the darkness, every hope that dared to challenge despair. Ungoliant fled north, and from her dark offspring would come the brood that haunted Middle-earth for ages, but her hunger would never be sated. In the aftermath of Lamath, Ungoliant disappeared into the uttermost reaches of the world, nursing her wounds and her rage in equal measure. But her brief alliance with Melkor had changed her in ways that would echo through all the ages of Arda. The light of the two trees that she had consumed had not simply vanished. It had been transformed, corrupted, turned into something that was neither light nor darkness, but a third thing, a force that carried the memory of illumination twisted into nightmare. She had grown beyond her original nature, evolved from a simple predator of light into something far more complex and dangerous. The radiance she had devoured had not destroyed her, as the Valar had hoped it might, but had instead catalyzed a transformation that made her the mother of a new form of darkness. Not the simple absence of light, but its active perversion. In the wastelands of the far south, beyond the reach of maps and the knowledge of the wise, she began her greatest work. The corruption within her, the transformed light of Valinor, twisted by her alien metabolism, demanded release. And so, in agonies that shook the foundations of the earth, she began to spawn. But these were not the mindless offspring that might have been expected from such a creature. Each egg she laid was infused with a fragment of the stolen light, creating beings that were part spider, part shadow, and part living memory of paradise lost. They emerged from their shells already ancient in malice, already possessed of an intelligence that was both utterly alien and terrifyingly focused. The greatest of these offspring was Shelob, who would in later ages make her lair in the pass of Cirith Ungol and become the terror of all who dared to approach the Black Land. But Shelob was merely the largest and most terrible of a brood that numbered in the thousands. Some were no bigger than hunting hounds, but possessed of venom that could kill hope itself. Others grew to rival their mother in size, becoming the great spiders of Mirkwood, the Atacops that would plague the woodland realm for all the ages of the world. Each carried within them a fragment of their mother's hunger, a need not just for physical sustenance, but for the consumption of light, hope, and beauty. They were living embodiments of entropy made manifest, creatures whose very existence was an assault upon the ordered beauty of creation. Wherever they went, darkness followed, not the natural darkness of night, which could be comforting and restful, but the malevolent shadow that sought to devour everything bright and fair. But Ungoliant's legacy was not limited to her direct offspring. The very act of consuming the light of the trees had sent ripples through the fabric of reality, creating resonances that would influence the shape of evil for all the ages to come. Every shadow that crept from corners grew somehow deeper and more menacing. Every web spun by the humblest garden spider carried within it an echo of her malice. Every moment when light failed or hope faltered bore some trace of her consumption of Valinor's glory. The wise among the Eldar, studying the patterns of shadow and malice in the world, began to perceive a terrible truth. Ungoliant had not simply destroyed the light of the trees, she had infected the very concept of illumination with her hunger. From that day forward, every light that burned in Middle-earth would carry within it the memory of its own potential destruction. Every flame would flicker with awareness of the darkness that sought to devour it. This infection spread in ways both subtle and profound. The great lamps that the Valar had kindled to light the world in its earliest days began to dim, their flames somehow less steady than they had been before. The stars themselves seemed to burn with less certainty, as if aware for the first time that their light was not eternal, not guaranteed, but something that could be stolen and consumed. Even the Silmarils, those greatest works of light and beauty that Melkor now wore in his crown, were affected. Though their radiance remained unmarred, those who looked upon them could sense something different about their glow. Not corruption exactly, but a kind of defensive wariness, as if the light within them had become aware of its own vulnerability. The psychological effects were equally profound. Across Middle-earth, sensitive spirits began to experience a new form of despair, not the clean grief of loss, or the sharp pain of defeat, but a gnawing sense that beauty itself was somehow fragile, that every work of art or moment of joy was merely feeding time before an inevitable consumption. Poets found their verses somehow less luminous than before, as if the very words for light and beauty had been tainted. Artists discovered that their depictions of radiance never quite captured what they remembered from before the darkness fell. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Ungoliant's legacy was the way it influenced the nature of evil itself. Where once malice had been content to corrupt and dominate, now it carried within it an element of pure consumption, a hunger that could never be satisfied. This change could be seen most clearly in Melkor himself, who had been transformed by his alliance with the Great Spider in ways he was only beginning to understand. Before Lammoth, his evil had been proud, creative in its perversity, interested in ruling and reshaping rather than simply destroying. But now there was something of Ungoliant's hunger in him, a need not just to dominate, but to devour, not just to corrupt, but to consume entirely. This new aspect of his malice would influence all his subsequent actions, driving him to acts of destruction that served no strategic purpose, feeding a hunger that grew with eating. His servants, too, were affected by this change. The orcs that emerged from the pits of Ungoliant after Lammoth were different from those that had come before, more savage, less capable of the crude civilization they had once possessed, driven by hungers that went beyond mere physical need. The Balrogs, though they had driven Ungoliant away, carried with them the memory of her darkness, and their flames, who burned with shadows that had not been there before. This corruption spread through all the works of darkness in Middle-earth. Sauron, Melkor's greatest lieutenant, would in later ages incorporate elements of Ungoliant's hunger into his own malice, creating the Nazgul as beings that consumed not just life, but the very will to resist. The dragons that would plague the later ages of the world would carry within their fire breath something of the spider's venom, breathing not just flame, but despair. Even the natural world was not immune to this influence. The great spiders of Mirkwood were merely the most obvious manifestation of a corruption that touched every web, every shadow, every dark corner where fear might take root. Wolves howled with voices that carried echoes of Ungoliant's hunger. Ravens and crows gathered in numbers greater than ever before, their black wings seeming to carry fragments of the unlight that had cloaked the spider's approach to the trees. The very geography of Middle-earth began to reflect this change. Dark forests grew darker, their shadows deeper and more menacing than mere absence of light should have made them. Mountain passes became more treacherous, not just from rockfall or weather, but from something that made travelers forget their purpose, lose their way, abandon hope of reaching their destinations. Rivers ran slower and more sluggishly, as if their water had been thickened with liquid despair. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of Ungoliant's legacy was not its immediate effects, but its implications for the future. She had demonstrated that even the greatest works of the Valar could be destroyed, that even the most fundamental aspects of creation were vulnerable to consumption. This knowledge would haunt the ages to come, influencing every great work that was attempted, every light that was kindled, every hope that dared to shine. Nay, in the darkness, the elves, once confident in their immortality and the permanence of beauty, now carried within them the knowledge that everything they loved could be devoured. The dwarves, delving deep into the earth for treasures of stone and metal, found their minds haunted by shadows that whispered of consumption and futility. Even the race of men, when they awakened under the stars, would be born into a world where the very concept of light carried within it the memory of its own violation. And somewhere in the uttermost south, beyond the reach of hope or help, Ungoliant herself continued her patient work. She had tasted the light of Valinor and found it good, but she had also learned that there were other lights in the world, other sources of illumination that might provide the satisfaction she craved. The Silmarils still blazed in Melkor's crown, but there would be other jewels, other flames, other moments of beauty that might feed her endless hunger. Some say she fled to the southern wastes, consuming even herself, vanishing into a hunger so deep it could not exist in Arda anymore. But others whisper that she waits still, patient and eternal, growing ever larger in the darkness, spawning ever more terrible offspring, preparing for the day when she might once again taste the light of paradise. And in the deep places of the earth, where shadows gather and hope grows thin, the wise sometimes claim they can hear it still, the sound of something vast and patient, spinning webs that span not just space, but time itself, waiting for the moment when the lights of the world grow dim enough for her to emerge once more and complete the feast that began in Valinor so long ago. In the vast tapestry of Arda's history, where threads of light and shadow interweave to create the pattern of ages, few events cast longer shadows than the pact between Melkor and Ungoliant. What began as a simple alliance of convenience, hunger wedding itself to hatred, darkness joining with malice, became something far more profound and terrifying. A fundamental alteration of the cosmic order, a wound in the heart of creation that would never fully heal. The wise who study such matters speak in hushed tones of threshold moments, points in the great music, where the harmony shifts so dramatically that everything that follows resonates with the change. The destruction of the two trees was such a moment, not merely the loss of two beautiful objects, but the introduction of a new principle into the world, the understanding that beauty itself was mortal, that even the greatest works of divine craftsmanship could be consumed and perverted. Before that terrible night in Valinor, creation had operated under certain implicit assumptions. Light was stronger than darkness, beauty more enduring than corruption, hope more fundamental than despair. The music of the Ainur had established these principles as cosmic constants, woven them into the very fabric of reality. Evil might corrupt, malice might twist, but at the deepest level, good would endure, light would triumph, love would prove stronger than hate. Ungoliant's feast shattered these assumptions with the finality of an avalanche. She had demonstrated that consumption could triumph over creation, that void could devour substance, that hunger itself could become a principle as fundamental as any other force in the universe. Where once there had been confidence in the ultimate victory of light, now there was only the terrible knowledge that everything beautiful, everything good, everything worthy of love existed under the constant threat of absolute negation. This change propagated through the ages like ripples from a stone cast into still water, touching every life, every choice, every moment of beauty or terror that would follow. The wars that raged across Middle-earth, the battles with Morgoth, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the long defeat of the Eldar, all of these carried within them the echo of that first great consumption. Every time hope failed, every time darkness seemed to triumph, every time beauty was destroyed or perverted, the shadow of Ungoliant's hunger could be detected by those wise enough to perceive such patterns. The very nature of heroism was transformed by this knowledge. Where once valor had meant the confident defense of what was right and good, now it required the courage to fight on, despite knowing that everything fought for could be utterly consumed. The greatest heroes of the later ages, Gil-galad, Elendil, even humble Sam Gamgee in his garden, displayed not the bright certainty of earlier times, but something far more precious. The determination to kindle light, knowing that it could be devoured, to create beauty, aware of its fragility, to hope in the face of absolute evidence that hope itself was mortal. The legacy of that ancient pact could be traced through every major catastrophe that befell Middle-earth. Sauron's corruption of the Númenóreans carried within it something of Ungoliant's hunger, not just the desire to rule, but to consume, to devour not just bodies but souls, to leave behind not conquest but emptiness. The dragon sickness that afflicted both Smaug and the men who beheld his horde was another manifestation of the same principle, the transformation of natural desire into something that devoured not just its object, but the one who desired. Even the Nazgul, those most terrifying servants of the Dark Lord, represented an evolution of the hunger principle. They were not merely slaves of evil, but beings who had been consumed so thoroughly that they had become appetite itself, existing only to feed their master's will, while simultaneously embodying the principle of negation that Ungoliant had introduced into the world. The One Ring itself, that supreme instrument of power and corruption, bore within its gold the same essential principle. It did not merely corrupt its bearers, it consumed them, slowly but inexorably, until nothing remained but an extension of its creator's will. The terror that wise beings felt when confronting it was not just fear of its power, but recognition of what it represented, the ultimate expression of Ungoliant's hunger, refined and focused into a single object of terrible beauty. But perhaps the most profound aspect of the legacy was its influence on the ultimate fate of Arda itself. The prophecy of Dagor Dagorath, the last battle that would end the world, spoke of a final confrontation between good and evil, light and darkness. Yet those who understood the deep currents of history knew that this battle had already been shaped by events in Valinor long ago. For when the end comes, and the wise say it surely will, it will not be heralded by the clash of armies or the breaking of mountains. It will begin with a familiar sound, the soft susurrus of something vast moving in the darkness, the whisper of webs being spun across the vault of heaven, the quiet noise of hunger finally returning to complete a feast that was interrupted long ago. Some among the Eldar believe that Ungoliant did not truly vanish from the world, but merely withdrew to its uttermost edges, growing ever larger in the darkness beyond the circles of creation, feeding on the void itself until she became something that defied all understanding. According to these theories, she waits still at the boundaries of existence, patient as only immortal hunger can be patient, preparing for the moment when the lights of the world grow dim enough for her to emerge and finish what she began. Others, perhaps more optimistically, believe that her consumption of the light of the trees contained within it the seed of her own destruction. Light, even perverted light, even consumed light, carries within it something that resists ultimate negation. Perhaps, in the deepest part of her alien being, the radiance of Laurelin and Telperion continues to burn, slowly transforming her from within, preparing some cosmic reversal that will undo the damage her hunger has wrought. But whether hope or despair proves correct in the end, the immediate legacy remains clear. The world bears scars from that ancient feast that will never fully heal. Every shadow contains the memory of unlight. Every flame flickers with awareness of its own mortality. Every moment of beauty exists under the constant threat of consumption. The children of Ilúvatar, elves and men, and all the lesser kindreds, live in a creation that has been fundamentally altered by the knowledge that nothing lasts forever, that even the greatest works of divine craft can be devoured by sufficiently focused hunger. This knowledge has made them more precious to themselves and to each other. But it has also filled their lives with a poignancy that was absent from the earlier, more innocent ages of the world. In the end, perhaps this is Ungoliant's most lasting legacy, not the specific destructions she wrought or the particular shadows she cast, but the fundamental alteration of existence itself. She taught creation that it was mortal, that beauty was fragile, that light could be devoured. And in learning these lessons, the world grew both more terrible and more precious, filled with a tragic grandeur that had not existed before the first great consumption. For in every age, darkness begins again, not with the sound of war, but with the silence of something devouring the light. The echo of that ancient hunger whispers so, till in every shadow, every web, every moment when hope falters and beauty fades. And until the music itself comes to its final resolution, until the last note of creation sounds across the void, that whisper will continue to remind all who listen that even the greatest lights can be consumed, that even the most enduring beauty can be devoured, that hunger itself has become one of the fundamental forces shaping the destiny of all that exists. The pact between Morgoth and Ungoliant was more than an alliance. It was a revelation, a terrible illumination of creation's ultimate vulnerability. And from that revelation flows all the tragedy and all the beauty of the ages that followed, forever marked by the knowledge that in the darkness something waits to consume whatever lights we dare to kindle. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.